Enterprise Management 360, your main source for tech news, analysis, podcasts, and videos for the enterprise.
Welcome to the EM360 Podcast, where we have weekly conversations with innovators that are continuously reshaping the enterprise tech landscape. I'm your host, Kevin Petrie, VP of Research at BARC, which is a global research and consulting firm focused on data, analytics, and AI. Today, Ben Schaechter, who is CEO and co-founder of Vantage, joins me to talk about FinOps practices and cloud costs. So Ben, thanks for joining the conversation.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you for having me.
So I'm really looking forward to digging into the problem of cloud cost governance with you today. This is an area that gets a fair amount of attention from our community of practitioners on a number of dimensions. And I think that you have a unique vantage point, if you'll permit the pun, on this important topic. So back in May, you shared some great insights on prior EM360 podcast with Dana Gardner of Inner Arbor Solutions. So you described challenges that are related to cloud spending, the discipline of FinOps, and the ways in which the Vantage platform addresses key use cases for FinOps, and with a particular focus on cloud cost observability. So I recommend that our listeners, if they haven't already listened to that podcast, today I wanted to build on that foundation of knowledge by exploring best practices in this area. What are the leading practitioners of FinOps doing right now? Where did they fail, and where did they get better? What can we learn from them? So I think this will be a great conversation. Maybe to start, we can recap takeaways from your prior conversation. What is cloud cost governance? Why is it such a problem? And how does FinOps help?
Yeah. So cloud cost governance is essentially ensuring that the spend that an organization has on public cloud, no one is questioning that that is a bad thing to do, but everyone would say that you want that spend to be efficient. And unlike a lot of other costs that an organization incurs, cloud spend in particular, there are various methods that you can do or that your organization can employ to ensure that the spend that you have on public cloud is efficient, that it is accounted for, that you have optimized those costs. And ultimately, one of the best ways to do that is to ensure that everyone at the organization has visibility into costs. And to kind of dive deeper on that, you can imagine at a very large enterprise organization, there might be hundreds or thousands of people or engineers in various functions that are responsible for contributing to those infrastructure costs, but they may not ultimately know what they're deploying on public cloud, how much that costs. And so having a system in place, and whether that be something homegrown or a vendor like Vantage, giving organizations the dashboards and the views into what their spend is day by day to ensure that they are guiding towards that efficient spend level. That is really what is at the heart of things from a FinOps perspective. So once your organization is able to get visibility on those costs, that's the best way to know how you can work towards making those costs more efficient. And to loop this all back to the organization, for a specific set of organizations, public cloud spend can be one of the main contributing costs to that organization. And these days, as the markets are really kind of focused more on efficiency from a margin perspective, behind people, cloud costs can be one of the top line items for a company. And so it tends to be a major area of focus these days. It's something that directly impacts the margins for the company. Often than not, it's also impacting the gross margin for the company. And so that's a good high level overview on how governance can help there.
That's great. And I can't help observing or commenting that there's this historical irony. If we rewind 15 years, the cloud was supposed to simplify things and make them cheaper, as with any aspect of tech. And I think this will prove with Gen AI. There are always new complexities and new sources of cost. So we make some incremental improvements rather than revolutionary improvements. But the notion of optimizing, better understanding, predicting, monitoring, and optimizing cloud costs is a really important success factor for a lot of companies. Okay, so now we're going to dig into the question of best practices At BARC, we do a lot of qualitative and quantitative research on best practices, and we find you can learn a lot by studying the leaders. So at Vantage, you work with a variety of enterprises, large and small, some very tech savvy, others that whose business model is not focused on tech necessarily. So it'll have large and small companies, traditional and new companies. What do you find distinguishes the leaders, the leading practitioners, when it comes to FinOps and cloud cost observability?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, even the last point that you made there, we can start with just why this is a complex problem, what the organization will do to solve that problem, and then really like what the leaders in this space have done from a practicing perspective to drive that kind of culture of governance and efficiency. So you hit it on perfectly, which is the cloud over the span of the last 10 years was marketed as being this really amazing thing that was supposed to make everything simpler. You could be efficient with spend. You can, only fire up servers when you need them, and you could shut them down when you're done. If we look back, the reason why this is such a hard problem for the company in the first place is 10 years ago, let's just take AWS. AWS was a mix of just EC2 or just S3 or just EBS. Today, they have 250 different services, each with their own bespoke pricing. Even just taking a single service like EC2, there's different server permutations for different regions. There's different life cycles. They all have their own different rates. And so it really has gotten just more complex. And that's just one provider. That's just AWS. The other market change that's happened is that increasingly organizations are using not just AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. They're using other services like Datadog, Databricks, Snowflake, MongoDB Atlas. Organizations and especially enterprises are using more and more of these services. And you're right that Gen AI is kind of giving a whole new set of providers that are specific to that space, each with their own kind of new ways of doing things from like a billing perspective. And so if you think about this from a customer perspective, how can you get control on all of these various providers from a spend perspective, knowing that each one of them has their own kind of bespoke pricing model? And so what we see from the kind of top performing companies in the space is they tend to centralize this all with a platform, FinOps or cloud economics team. That team is responsible for either doing this in-house through a platform they may do in a homegrown fashion, or obviously with Vantage, that is what we give our customers the ability to do. They can connect all the providers that they use that are relevant to them. We do all of the work of ingesting and normalizing all of that data, and then giving them the tools to actually make their teams empowered from a visibility perspective to ensure that all of that is under control. What I would say to answer your question directly, what the leaders in the space do, you can imagine at an organization that has hundreds or thousands of engineers, you want to ensure that there's some consistency there. And so the best companies in the space typically have a centralized team of a small number of people. I would say anywhere from 1 to probably the high end 4 to 5 people. And the titles of those people are a FinOps team, a cloud economics team. Sometimes it's someone that's just like a platform team within the infrastructure group or the cloud center of excellence. Sometimes it's included with that. It really just depends upon how the organization thinks about it. They'll be the ones that are kind of getting everything set up from a data perspective, or getting a vendor set up like Vantage, and ensure that they have the high level reporting structure down by, hey, these are the business units that we have or the services that we have. Let's ensure that we have a dashboard or set of reports that are available to each of not only the services or business units at that organization, but also set up for the key personas that are going to be really like looking at those reports. And you can imagine there's probably a different view for engineering. There's probably a different view for finance or management. Well, this team is relatively small, anywhere from 2 to 4 people. If you look at some of the logos on our homepage, Square, Aflac, Rippling, Vercel, this is where that centralized team is working on behalf of the broader organization. And while that team might only be a few people, there are hundreds or thousands of users at that company that are all using something like Vantage to log into the system, make sure that they can see their respective set of costs. They have a budget assigned to their respective set of costs, and they can receive proactive alerts like, hey, there's something anomalous that happened. You need to go and remediate that the day that it happened versus, waiting for it to hit your bill. And then it's kind of like a fire drill where you have to go back in time. And so the most successful customers will kind of train the organization and empower the organization to be set up for success, and then ensure that they're regularly meeting with all of the stakeholders or people responsible for that portion of the business to ensure, hey, it's the end of the quarter. Let's do a spend review. This is where your team had really good progress. This is where your team has room for improvement. It's more of like an internal consultative and training-based approach. Those are the organizations that I see having the most success. And at the end of this, really, it's just very simple that visibility drives kind of like the goal, right? And if your teams don't have visibility into what their spend is or what their goals are, how can you ever hold them accountable? Vantage makes that very, very simple. And so that's kind of the pitch and a high level overview of what we see the most successful companies doing.
Okay. So that's very interesting. I know that I've done some research in this area, and one of the survey findings that has stood out to me is from the FinOps Foundation. They found that one of the primary challenges, if not the primary challenge, is getting technical people to change behavior based on what they learn about cloud spending implications of what they're doing with IT resources. And so there are myriad different components and interrelationships that you need to track, so there can be surprises in terms of what the cloud compute bill or the cloud resource bill is going to be. But in the end, once you get a handle on that, changing the behavior is critical. Maybe you could elaborate just a little bit on that point in terms of, I like the notion of visibility and cross-functional communication, get everyone on the same page. It seems that there's a point at which you can call up your accidental or bad actors who have runaway applications or projects that are creating ballooning costs and fix things on a one-time basis. But what are best practices to change behavior in more of a proactive, longer-term way?
Yeah, so a few different things. So first of all, I actually agree with what has traditionally been a problem for organization, the report that you mentioned, where it's really hard to get engineers to take action. And one thing that we found is that engineers in particular, if they don't have a tool that's set up for an engineering kind of perspective, then people aren't going to use it. They're not going to trust it. And we have tens of thousands of users on Vantage. By numbers, the vast majority of our users of our platform are engineers. And the system is set up for engineers to kind of see things in their own language. There's a different approach that Vantage takes to show when you have your specific set of costs, you can drill in and see, hey, here's the specific resources that I have from an engineering perspective. I can see my own sets of resources that are profiled from Vantage in addition to the raw cost and usage data that comes in from a billing perspective, to give engineers kind of their specific view to go and remedy these things. Unlike a lot of other solutions in the space that will just tell you, hey, here's like your accrued costs. You don't see the specific resources that are driving that. It can be just kind of clunky. We have an extreme focus on ease of use, self-service. There's a Terraform provider. There's an API, kind of meeting engineers where they are to ensure that they can actually take action. So that's kind of a high-level overview there. Actually, do you mind just repeating the second portion of your question just one more time? I want to make sure I answer that correctly.
Yeah, and I think you've largely addressed this, but I guess one dimension to this was, okay, you can get folks to remediate a problem at a given point in time, but on a systematic, forward-looking basis, how do you change longer-term behavior? Because the more you can get ahead of a risk and prevent it from emerging as you're in the project planning phase, the better.
Got it. Right. So yeah, on that, there's a couple different things that we have that you're correct. Like, if you were coming in just to have like an anomaly that, is like kind of a one and done thing that's helpful every once in a while, but, you hope that that's kind of the exception, not the norm. We have a set of features that can kind of put costs within perspective of the organization. And I'll just give you like an anecdote or an example of this, which is we have something called business metrics. Business metrics allow organizations to pipe into the system top line metrics about their business, pretty self-explanatory, to view things like cost per customer, cost per million load balancer requests. You can have margin or cost of goods sold targets. And on a cost report, which is kind of like our main primitive or dashboard view that an engineer will go in and see their costs, it might be okay that your costs are trending up, but what you'll want to see is that per unit cost, right? And that per unit cost for your organization might be, hey, we want to have, an 80% margin on this or a 50% margin on that, or we want to make sure that our cost per customer is trending down because we have an organizational goal. That's where there's kind of the interplay between what the usage is from a business perspective and your underlying set of costs. And so one thing that organizations will do is within Vantage actually set up these top line business metrics, give their teams visibility into not only their associated costs, which might be trending up, but relative to that top line business metric, they're actually going down on a per unit basis. And this is really the spirit of looking at things from a view that is relevant for your organization. And how do you kind of have that relate back to the overall organization from like a financial perspective, if it's a financial goal that you have, or really like mapping things to how your business runs perspective, if it's about like cost per million customers or things along those lines. And so that's a case where it's actually empowering engineers to get some business context. And then, when engineers have that business context, they can kind of plan accordingly from a, hey, I'm going to not just fire up this over provisioned server because I know that's going to hit me from like a margin perspective. And the best way to do that is really to just make people aware of it. And so that's just one example of something that I see kind of employed to drive like the best kind of behavior from that perspective.
Good stuff. So it's always educational to consider the maturity curve. Every organization goes through a process of defining their problem, experimenting with solutions, and then getting some traction, iterating, and getting to more of a robust and mature way to address it. I'd love to hear your perspective on the learning process for FinOps of the leading practitioners that you've worked with. Where did they start? Where did they fail? And how did their approach to FinOps improve over time?
Yeah, this is one thing that is just so specific to the organization. And we have customers that, to your point on like where they're at on the maturity curve, it is so interesting just to see when a customer shows up to Vantage. Are they in the crawl stage? Are they in the walk stage? Are they in the run stage? And there's kind of like different ways that you can meet them where they are on that perspective. I'll tell you, I actually like the question of like, hey, where do people or organizations fail? Because that's actually like maybe the easier one, or like the more broad strokes answer. The area where I actually see organizations fail the most is where one person tries to do everything themselves. And this is where, as an organization, usually it's like in that crawl or walk stage where you might have someone on your team whose devoted job may not be FinOps or cloud cost management, and someone's kind of either been tasked with it because it's turned into a problem, or it's just that someone has a natural interest to go about doing this on their own. And usually what I see is where this person is just too siloed. So they might, be tasked with looking at all this work. They might be putting it upon themselves. They're not engaging others in the organization. And especially as an organization is growing up, I mean, if you think about like a series B, C, or D company, if one person is trying to manage that all on their own, it tends to just become too big of a problem for one person to manage. On the flip side, the point that we had discussed a little bit earlier, the thing that I see go really well is when that one person begins sharing information with others in the organization and really making it collaborative on a single platform. And, whether that's a tool developed in-house or something that's running on like a hosted provider like a Looker or Tableau, or you're using a FinOps specific platform like Vantage, one of the things that we look at for our customer base is how many users are in the platform, how engaged are they, how often are they coming into the platform, and that's usually a really good success metric. From that being the leading indicator, you tend to get more success with the, what I would call like the specific things that are important from that maturation curve from a FinOps perspective. If you have people logging into the platform, you have people taking a look at costs, typically that maps to them getting better hygiene from a cost allocation perspective, getting things covered from a commitment perspective. And so engagement with the platform is really like the best thing that you can do for your organization to drive success there. And I use like an example here, which I might need to change, but it's like, if you have like a goal of like losing weight or something, but you don't know how much you weigh, it's really hard to know how you're tracking towards that goal. And it's kind of the same thing with public cloud. Like if you want people to have like a goal for their team or a spend level for their team, you want to make sure that those people are empowered to go and get visibility. And if no one's looking at anything, it's just one person's job, and that person is kind of internal to the company, kind of shouting on their own. Like it's really hard to change things from like a cultural perspective. So that's kind of a high level overview of where I see organizations have a trickier time. And then on the flip side to it, like where we see people have more success.
Okay, good. So a final question here. I'd love to hear about a real case study, and no need to name names. If you can, great, but no need. A Vantage customer that can serve as a good role model for the newcomers to FinOps, the folks that are in the crawl stage.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give a couple examples from the same company that is an organization that is a large enterprise organization. They have thousands of employees at the organization in general. Actually, I think tens of thousands, and then more than 1,000 employees are on Vantage. And they have hundreds of cost reports that are set up for each one of those teams. And what they are doing that is actually really interesting is that we have a Terraform provider. It allows you to actually express all of these reports as infrastructure as code, or more specifically, what we've coined FinOps as code. And as they launch new services or as they form new teams, when you are deploying infrastructure, when they are deploying infrastructure, they're doing that all through Terraform. So they might be creating, new Kubernetes clusters that have auto-scaling components. They might be using other services like a Snowflake or Databricks or Datadog. All of that is actually being defined as infrastructure as code. The thing that they're doing alongside that is that they are creating a specific Vantage dashboard and team to track those respective set of costs at the time that all of that is provisioned. And the nice thing about what Vantage allows here is, as the team has defined their infrastructure, they can update the respective set of cost allocation tags and apply that Terraform provider to Vantage as well, so that the entire kind of cost scaffolding for that team is set up along the way. The nice thing here too is that if their infrastructure ever changes, let's say they fire up a new, queue processing system as part of that infrastructure, they can make sure that that same queue processing system is represented in the Vantage FinOps kind of portion of that Terraform template and update that cost dashboard accordingly. Each one of those services or teams, when that dashboard is set up, they also have an integration with their identity provider, which is Okta. And so they can ensure that, hey, we want to stand up a cost dashboard with this infrastructure. We want to make sure that this user group from the identity provider is actually tied to that dashboard. And they want to make sure that the specific Slack channel that team is actually operating in is getting access and alerts for that cost provider. This is what I would call something that's emblematic of like a really well functioning culture from a FinOps perspective, where like teams are regularly reviewed on what they're deploying, what their spend is, and ultimately it's an organization where cloud costs materially contribute to their cost of goods sold. And why is that important? If you can get efficiencies for a late stage private company or a publicly traded company from teams being really empowered and excited for driving gross margin efficiencies, that's where you can really unlock value from if those employees are shareholders in the organization, if it's a publicly traded company, ultimately for all the public shareholders. And cloud costs tend to be one of the main drivers there, and that organization has really nailed it. This has been something that they've been working on for 2-ish years, I would say, and it's where their centralized FinOps team started with really a single person who set up the platform, and that single person was going out and educating all of the respective teams, making sure that they were all set up and trained with Vantage. And then over time, because that centralized FinOps person did such a good job, he was promoted. He has multiple FinOps folks on his team, and they've driven really like this amazing adoption curve where there are over 1,000 employees actively using Vantage across hundreds of different dashboards. And so that is like what I would call like a great automated example where a cloud cost vendor can really be in the operations flow and driving the right behavior at the organization.
Fantastic. And so I know I said it was my last question, but I can't resist a follow-up, which is, it sounds to me like the company you're talking about is the kind of company that is somewhat data-driven to begin with. And you can agree or disagree with that. The reason I ask is we find increasingly that a data culture, a data-oriented culture, is really important to the DNA in terms of how individuals and teams approach problems. And I'm wondering if there's advice about instilling that type of culture more broadly.
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, I agree. It's a data-driven organization. I think it's really hard to engage in FinOps, not having, at least a smidge of like an interest in accounting.
You gotta have some orientation for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is where if you would say you're an organization that, has room to grow on that side of things, I actually think that's where like a vendor can really help, because there's kind of two different ways that you can go about this. You can have someone on your software engineering team go and do all the work, pull all of the cost and usage data, structure that. And if your organization is weaker on that side of the house, I would generally encourage, I'm obviously biased, but I would generally encourage employing like a vendor, because we kind of do all that heavy lifting for you. And then you're just set up very quickly, time to value, to have a self-service dashboard that you can interact with. The other thing that we do for customers, and it's really more helpful for folks in that crawl stage, I would say, is that every single one of our customers is assigned a customer success manager that's like trained in FinOps and cloud infrastructure that can help train from like a authentic, technical, genuine, consultative approach. And it's very common for us to kind of even help be that FinOps person in the event that the organization doesn't have that to start, so that you could be trained and the organization could kind of grow from that initial seedling there. I always tell folks you should think of us as being your outsourced cloud cost team, even if you are like very mature, and it's actually way, way, way more helpful for someone who's just getting started with that, culture of data, or just beginning to employ that. And ultimately, all companies will have to get a view on this from a cloud cost perspective, assuming that, public cloud costs are material at all to your organization.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it makes sense, because the first is sort of a dawning realization, okay, we've got a problem, which is cloud costs are too high. And the second problem is we have no idea why. So then if you can have, in plain terms, stark visual terms, the costs and the causes illustrated to you, that can start to change behavior.
Exactly. And I mean, the final thing I'll say on that is like, in that world, usually the customer is just getting like the bill 12 times a year from AWS. And then the next question is like, okay, like, why is this bill so high? Which team drove it? What are the specific resources? Were there anomalies that we could have caught? And you kind of get that out of the box with Vantage.
So Ben, thank you very much. I've gotten smarter. I appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights. And thank you to everyone for listening as well. We hope you took a lot away from today's podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, you can head over to Vantage's website. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you can subscribe to this podcast on all our major platforms and follow the conversation on socials. So there's at EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn. There's also great daily content on EM360tech.com. Ben, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.